Okay. So we're calling this Towards a Wellbeing Society, and the agenda, as I said before, was to raise all our own public funding without borrowing, improve everyone's quality of life, vanquish poverty, contribute to climate justice, promote an entrepreneurial culture, and create a true property-owning democracy. And you probably think that that is unbelievable. So Scotland's land, as I said, is 78 billion square metres, excluding the seabed. But because urban Scotland has, most buildings are over 1 floor in height, I've multiplied that area defined as urban by a factor of 2. So we have a total square meterage of nearly 85 billion square metres. According to the most recent GERS report, the total spend either in or on behalf of Scotland by various agencies is over £81 billion. But I've added to that in order to address austerity, infrastructure and pay for a universal citizen's income. So I've increased the figure to a whopping £138,440,700,000. Okay, so how do we raise all our public funding from our land to replace all existing taxes? Well, it's a model of annual ground rent, which is charged per square metre on the land, roof and floor space levied according to certain agreed land types. And we call it AGFR, which is annual ground, floor and roof rent. Okay. Now, for simplicity, I just have 4 land types, but it would be possible to have a variation of that. You could have as many variations as the policymakers wanted. You could differentiate between commercial and residential and various types of commercial, charitable, public service places, as many as you wanted. But really, as an illustration, I've just kept to 4 land types. Yeah. So, yeah. Right, there you go. Right, so what to consider when setting a rate for each land type? Most folk live or work in urban areas. Arable land is generally more productive than rough grazing. Forest and woodland is more productive than rough grazing. Most public amenities, etc., are in urban areas, so through extensive use require greater maintenance, repair, replacement, etc. And urban areas, however, create greater wealth generally through the knowledge economy from a smaller area. And we have an imperative to protect and repopulate rural Scotland. So the suggested rates per land type, and I've shown what percentage of the total is part of these of Scotland's land area. We've got rough grazing, which is charged at 0.051 per square metre. Arable's the same, and urban's a whopping £10.01 per square metre. And the right-hand column shows you the contribution which each sector or each urban type to the total. So you'll see that the vast majority of it, over 98%, is contributed by urban land types. Okay, so how we calculate your AGFR is you measure the footprint of each floor of your building, add the area of your roof, add the area of your garden or land, add the area of any pavement or publicly owned verge outside it, add half the area of the roadway, multiply the total by the applicable rates, and then you make your return online to Revenue Scotland. And then you pay it either in full or probably 10 monthly instalments, as you do with your council tax just now. And that's just a wee illustration of how you would add it up if this was a property that was sort of self-contained and didn't share any common amenity grounds or things of that nature. Okay, so variations to standalone properties. In rural settings, only non-agricultural buildings would attract the urban rate. Otherwise, the land would just attract what the rate was, whether it was rough grazing or cultivated land. In urban settings, the combined property and garden would attract the urban rate. The liability for common property and tenement property, you'd be responsible for the floor area of your flat, plus say a sixth of the, if there were 6 flats in the block, 1/6 of the foundations, the roof, the back court, any front garden, pavement, etc., closed stair, that kind of thing. Landowners of urban type properties have been entitled to recover the AGFA from their tenants. If that wasn't to be the case, then that would mean that anyone who was a tenant wouldn't contribute anything to public funds. So obviously it's necessary to make sure that people contribute towards the public funding, but the liability for payment to the Revenue Scotland would still rest with the landlord, but he or she could recover it from their tenants. And landowners of agricultural land would be entitled to recover half the AGFA levied on the land. So that means a tenant farmer would only have to pay half the going rate. Okay, so why would you make your return? Well, first of all, there'd be spot checks by Revenue Scotland with hefty penalties for inaccurate or dishonest returns and failure to make a return in time. The register would be public, so everyone's return would be transparently self-policing, and whistleblowing would not be discouraged. So it basically means that if you've got a semi-detached house, then with maybe 1 or 2 slight modifications, because your garden's maybe slightly smaller than your neighbours next door in the other half of the villa, they should be more or less the same. So if somebody was basically, you know, being dishonest, then it would be possible to, you know, for that to be discovered, and so people would be encouraged to be honest, and also to make sure that, you know, that other people were basically playing the game. There'd be no tax evasion or avoidance, and there'd be 100% collection rate, because at the start of every financial year, a charge would be levied against all the title deeds for the properties, so that would prevent their sale or mortgage until the AGFA was paid. It's a wee bit like a notice of potential liability, which house factors can put on properties where there's outstanding common charges or factors of bills due. And if it remained unpaid for 3 years, then Revenue Scotland has the power to repossess the ground and to sell it or whatever to recover the outstanding AGFA interest and legal costs, and any balance would be paid back to the former owner. And examples of, here's an example of the total annual household or business contribution which there would be to public funds. So as you can see, the 3-bedroomed modern semi-detached with garden ground, I've taken one example, it'd be about £4,400 or thereby. A small flat would be £956. A single fronted shop, £705. A tenanted farm. Now, this is a tenanted farm of about 400 acres, of which there are very, very few in Scotland, actually, with farmhouse and agricultural buildings. It would pay a fairly substantial figure of about nearly £87,000. But then a tenanted farm of, say, 100 acres with farmhouse and agricultural buildings, relatively small farm, would be only paying £8,800. And then rough grazing and woodland of 221,000 acres, or 894,355,269 square metres, they'll be paying something in the region of about £45 million a year. And that's roughly what Anders Poulsen, the Danish billionaire, owns in, that's what he would be paying for the ownership of his ground in Scotland. And that's in addition to any urban rate which he would be paying for any non-agricultural buildings on his land. Because just now, I mean, apart from maybe stocking rates and things like that, which he has, and I know that he's not in favour of that sort of thing, he really doesn't have to contribute anything, you know, towards public funds with his land holdings. He's got to make a return to the Danish Danish Treasury for his land holdings everywhere, whether they're in Denmark or abroad, and that includes Scotland, of course. But just now, he doesn't need to make that make basically much of a contribution towards public funding in Scotland whatsoever. So what a person on average annual earnings of 26,500 would save if we brought in this system is illustrated here. You currently pay income tax and national insurance, and these figures are all taken from publicly available information. These are average figures which have been provided. Council tax for a kind of average house, that price range. VAT and other consumer taxes in the year, and then the AGFR on a modern 70-detached villa I've shown as well. So the total you could potentially save would be about £6,000, nearly £7,000 if we abolished all taxes and brought in this system instead. Okay, now here's some examples. Balmoral Castle, for example. Currently the band H annual council tax is less than £2,700 for the castle. With AGFR under this system, it would go up to £140,000 a year. And in addition to that, all the other buildings and the land itself would also be charged. The former Co-op HQ in Glasgow, the Coffin End between Morrison Street and Paisley Road. That site, actually the building was lying derelict for a number of years, or semi-derelict, and was contributing nothing to public funds. And then there was a fire in 2013, and the property had to be demolished. The owners, who belong to a Belfast-based company, have done nothing with the site. They got the insurance money. They didn't even have to contribute towards the police and the fire brigade, etc. So that's a site that's basically just lying as a hole in the ground now, and it was an eyesore for many, many years. But under AGFR, they would have to have been paying over £200,000 a year for it. Jordan Hill School, which I think is the only publicly funded school in Scotland out with the local authorities. There might be another one, but I think this is the one at the end of Glasgow. It's in Jordan Hill, obviously. There's a primary department, a secondary department, and it's got quite handsome playing fields with it as well. The AGFR in it would be over £600,000. But when you compare that towards the national insurance contributions and other things, employers' national insurance contribution and other taxes it's got to pay just now, it's roughly 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So if you introduced AGFR and charged it to schools, it would basically, set each other off against each other. So there really wouldn't be any increased liability there. The Queensferry Crossing, I worked out roughly that, it would be probably over £800,000 for the Queensferry Crossing. Now, Helensburgh in the Grass Verges. Now, if you know Helensburgh at all, it was developed in the late 18th, early 19th century in a grid pattern. And a feature of it is the verges, which are around all the gardens, with the lovely cherry blossom trees, etc. But the owners of the houses don't actually own the verges. They're owned by Lussey Estates, the Cahoon family. But Lussey Estates refuse to cut the grass and maintain the trees, and it's basically just expected that the owners of the houses will do that. But if you're a house owner there and you want to get access to build maybe a new garage or entrance into your grounds or something like that, you've got to pay a ransom of probably between £15,000 and £25,000 to Lussey Estates just to get their permission to do that. You've still got to pay for the physical building of the entrance, etc. But Lussey Estates do that, and they make a pretty handsome return on this every year alone. But they pay nothing for the ground which they own in the town itself. But under my system, they would be liable to pay somewhere in the region of 1.6, £1.7 million for all these verges which they own. And there'll be other examples of this up and down Scotland of big landowners that are still creaming money off of things where they don't make any contribution at all to their maintenance and repair. Stop with this system. Rothiemurchus here, just for the land, it would be calculated with about 2.2 million. That would be the AGFA on that. Murrayfield, it would be 2.7, or thereby it would be the payment that would be due for it. And BA Systems in Glasgow, for their 2 yards, there's Govan and Scotstoun. The AGFA on that would be probably about £13 million a year, but that is significantly less than the profit which they generally make of a year from basically their Glasgow activities. So it would actually be, although they, so they if they ran their operation from Glasgow as opposed to running it from down south, then their tax saving would be considerable, and that would in turn mean there'd be a benefit because they would have those funds to reinvest in Scotland, because it would be to their advantage to do it here, because they weren't having to pay corporation tax and all these kind of things which they're paying just now. 180 hectares in Easterhouse. Well, this was a site which the council, the old Glasgow Corporation, demolished the properties years ago. I think it's probably in the 1970s. They've done nothing with it apart from grass it over. They left the street, as you can see, the street lights up and the pavements, but they've done nothing with it. It's contributed nothing, towards the local population at all. They're now planning, to build houses on it or get it developed. But that site with no development is probably worth, in AGFA terms, over £18 million a year. And if they had modest 2-storey properties on it, there'd be about £54 million a year created, which would make the place, much more pleasant and give people decent housing, and improve the lot of living in that particular area of the city. And the places, Glasgow's riddled with these sort of sites. There's hundreds of them, maybe not quite as big as 180 hectares, but they're all over the place. This is a wee development in St Andrews, I think, which is being built just now. It's a wee 1-bedroomed flat, £1,500. This is a cottage. This was actually a cottage that we had for 25 years in the northeast of Scotland, in Sandend, C9, and that was our cottage. So the 2-bedroom cottage with a living room, kitchen, and it would be about £2,000 a year for that. This is a property in Sunnylord Drive in Paisley, built by John Lawrence way back in the 1950s. And again, it's a 2-bedroomed house, quite a small house, and about 2,160. Inverness, this was one of the houses that was built for the Inverness Housing Expo that some of you might remember. It was quite a big house, a rather nice house, I thought, and the AGFA on that is just over £10,000. Crow Road in Glasgow, a big red sandstone Edwardian tenement flat, really quite substantial, and it's over to £7,000 there. And then the Russell Institute in Paisley, which was built for the health service originally, has been restored, and it's now activities. So for on that one. Melbourne Golf Club at Largs, its included course is coming in about £40,000 a year. I don't know, you still hearing me all right? Okay. Now this property, the Cromlech at Sandbank, can you hear me, Ruth? Okay. Yeah,
you're fine. Yeah,
right, that's fine. This property is a rather unusual Victorian house with huge grounds in Dunoon. And it was just my luck that when I was doing a presentation in Dunoon a couple of years ago, the owner of this house was in the audience, and he just about had a heart attack when he saw that he was going to have to be paying a considerable amount in AGFA. But I started to interrogate him, and I said, "How many people live in that house?" And he says, "Oh, it's just me." And I said, "How many bedrooms have you got?" He says, 8. And I said, "Well," I said, "maybe we're sort of trying to tell you something, if you feel that you can't afford AGFA on it, then, how are you affording to maintain it? Because ownership just doesn't include the entitlement to own. There's also an obligation to maintain. I said, have you thought of either dividing it up or maybe selling a bit of ground or anything like that? Anyway, the story goes, I'm informed that actually within 6 months he'd sold the property. So maybe he had taken a leaf out of my suggestions, and that's what happened there. So next one, Nardini's in Largs. It's a single-story building now. It's about 47,000 they'd be paying. The townhouse in Kirkcaldy worked out about 144,000. And then, so the consequences for you are no tax on income or endeavour, no tax on purchased goods and services, no tax on inheritance or capital, no need for tax advisors. So if they're chartered accountants, they're going to have to find something else to do. There's no council tax or commercial rates, no business taxation, and there's no adverse effect on the market value of your house or business premises because we're not assessing it on that basis. And there is certainty of how much you pay at the start of any given year, because with the current tax systems, we don't know how much tax we pay at the start of a year for the year preceding, whereas under this system, you know exactly how much you'd be paying at the start of the year and be able to budget accordingly. Also, you'd have a much higher disposable income to spend as you see fit, opportunity to buy land as communities or individuals at low prices, provided you pay the AGFR levied on it. And I've also included within this, as I mentioned, that every man and child would have a universal citizens' income of roughly £200 a week, replacing most social security payments. And I'm suggesting that 10% of everyone's weekly citizens' income is invested in a menu for Scottish businesses through the investment bank. So everyone has an actual personal interest in our economy. So nobody would be excluded from having a personal interest in the Scottish economy. Now, consequences for the big landowners. Well, initially they might not be able to sleep at night. There would be a rush by them to offload either by sale, rent, or give it away even, uneconomic land and buildings, thus initially reducing the market price substantially of land. They won't keep land which doesn't provide sufficient income to pay the AGFR, but they will benefit from all the other assets not subject to inheritance or other wealth or capital taxes. And it will be in their interest to develop, diversify, and maintain, etc., land that they retain. And they won't claim ownership of land which is unproductive, which they currently do because of unspecific titles. The ones I usually suggest is the Duke of Argyll. Historically, the title deeds to the Duke of Argyll said, "All inhale the lands of Argyll," and that was it. No plans or anything. So that if you've got a dispute with the Duke of Argyll over what you own and what he owns, then you've got to have a pretty good, accurate plan in your title deeds. Otherwise, you're basically in a hiding to nothing, because he owns the whole of Argyll under exception of what's been sold off or conveyed, since then. Now, the position with AGFR is because the owner of the land or property must make the return to the land, to Revenue Scotland. That is indicating the total extent of what you own and your liability. So if you do that, but as a big landowner, and then, at a later date say, well, I actually own more land than that, through the land register with maybe a title dispute, a boundary dispute, then that basically is an attempt to defraud Revenue Scotland. If you're claiming, on the one hand, you don't own as much land, and then the other hand, you are claiming you are. So it would resolve so many of these problematics, title conditions, etc., and boundaries which the land register, has, and the courts just now actually have to deal with. So it would be a big boon to completing the actual land register, because it's a big problem for the land register to complete it just now because of these big historic titles which are pretty inspecific in general. Okay. For local authorities, it would increase their budgets, and there could be further devolution of power. They could actually set their own AGFR, and they'd also be saving in employers' national insurance contribution, as well as some other tax liabilities that they have. But they would need to manage or dispose of their land and property portfolio to meet the AGFR charge, because It applies to public land or land in public ownership as much as land that is in private ownership. It would help the housing shortage because it would release surplus land. It would reduce their bureaucracy quite considerably. And there would be a major reduction in empty properties and derelict sites, so it would actually improve the environment and the look, particularly of our urban landscapes, that properties and land that have been lying derelict for donkey's years are actually now having something done with them. Okay, so the consequences for Scotland are the government would have certainty of source and the amount of public revenue every year at the start of every year, which it doesn't have just now. It would have substantially more public and private funds to invest in Scotland's future and abolish poverty. And I've not even included the wealth from our seas, which we could invest in sovereign funds for future generations. We can become a true property owning and sharing democracy by ensuring that, first of all, people get their universal citizens' income, plus a small portion of that is invested on their behalf every year. And it would encourage businesses to set up and invest in Scotland, because basically they would know when they were preparing to set up a business what it was going to cost them. And we know that the first 5 years of a business are the most dangerous, because 1 year your profits can go up, next year your income drops away down. It doesn't keep constant. And because of the vagaries of the tax system, you can be hit with a tax bill when you least expect it, or you find difficulty with your liquidity. So this is this would be one means of helping businesses establish in a firm footing without, as I say, the vagaries of the current taxation systems which we have in the UK. Also, it would encourage immigration of high-end spending individuals, but that would be subject to the conditions we impose. Scotland and Britain historically has been an open door to people buying property in Britain, whereas countries such as Denmark, Norway too, I think, and others, they restrict. They usually have a residence condition, maybe 5 years before you can buy something that you're actually going to occupy as your main residence. We don't have that in the UK. So it would be up to the Scottish Parliament to decide under what terms and conditions we would allow foreign individuals to come in and buy property in our country. Our public finances would always be in credit. We wouldn't need to borrow under this system, because we're basically, the government is receiving the money on a monthly basis as they go. It reduces the bureaucracy of government. I mean, the cost of the taxation systems in the UK are huge. They're into billions of pounds. HMRC employs, I think, around about 65 million people. 65,000 people. So it's a huge cost. Whereas the bureaucracy of operating this system requires very, very, very little in the way of people by comparison, and most of the work can actually be done by algorithms with the way technology has developed in that regard. It can end the black market. I mean, the black market, to a large extent, is involved in people avoiding taxation, whether it's getting somebody to do a homer, or avoiding VAT, so they're not declaring the VAT, etc., and all this kind of stuff. Because you're not having VAT or income tax and things of that nature, to a large extent, not all, but to a large extent, you could end the black market. I've called it Scotland's Darien Revenge. Who needs tax havens if you've got a system like this, which is very transparent and just indicates what the owner of land or property, etc., would be liable to pay at the start of the year. And with the introduction of the universal citizens' income, we can really vanquish poverty. I mean, £200 a week for every man, woman and child is a substantial amount of money for people actually to get to, fund their lifestyles. It would really lift them out of poverty. That sort of figure, and it's possible, through this particular system. Now, where does this all come from? So there are huge areas of privately owned derelict and empty land and floor space in urban Scotland, massive areas of it. There's huge areas of publicly owned land and floor space not contributing to national revenue. And even the Land Commission has accepted that in their vacant and derelict land task force, and they even admitted that over 60% of that is in the public sector. So it just shows you how much the public sector have been sitting on stuff, doing nothing for years. And in addition to that, there's a lot in the private sector as well, both not just in urban areas, but in rural areas too, which have just been sitting, contributing nothing towards public funds. And apart from buildings, basically all of rural and urban lands contributing nothing to national revenue. We've got areas owned by charities like the National Trust, not really contributing very much to national revenue. It would be up to policymakers again to decide, if there were some mitigation to be done so that they weren't liable to pay, all the AGFR which they would otherwise have to pay. But that would be something to exemptions and reliefs would need to be something, decided by Parliament. And there are also significant areas of public open space, which basically are not stewarded. And they are a public asset funding source. If you think of things like the verges around motorways and dual carriageways and all that kind of stuff, they're really not thought of so much as an asset, but there is a potential there to do exciting things. In South Korea, for example, around the middle of their motorways, they have solar panels. There's just one example, of what we could do. It's just about thinking about land in a different way and how it can contribute towards public funds. So there are options under devolution, because we could bring this in under devolution as well as under independence. It can be introduced under Section 80I of the Scotland Act, which has been amended a few times since 1998. The AGFR is paid directly to Revenue Scotland, so there is no need to involve HMRC in this, because the money comes direct to Revenue Scotland and not to HMRC. Under the current arrangement, income tax, which on earned income, which is goes to the Scottish Government. I see Kate Forbes was saying that it takes 2 years for her to get that money from the time it's paid to the HMRC, who then take a cut by way of a fee, an administration fee. She gets the net figure 2 years after we've actually paid the income tax. Under this system, she gets it right away. She gets it on a monthly basis. So that's a huge benefit for public funding. If we're doing this under devolution, we would still need to pay the UK imposed taxes as well as AGFR. But the Scottish Government, for example, set a zero rate of income tax, which would mean that that would be quite a considerable saving for taxpayers. You wouldn't have council tax or these other sort of taxes. So it would expose the deficiencies in the GERS guesstimates for Scotland if we were to do that. And it would also give the councils the opportunity to charge their own land types, designating all areas of Scottish Government responsibility as local, which is permitted under the schedule to the Scotland Act. And would also have the power to exempt or relieve certain land holdings, as I say, charitable charities or public land from AGFR. Now, how Scotland becomes a truly property-owning democracy, an entrepreneurial dynamo? Well, as I said, 10% of the universal citizen's income would be invested on behalf of every citizen. Citizens could cash in their bond at the end of each year if they wished, but at least 1 year's investment would have to be retained. And that would produce a minimum of £5.5 billion a year of Scottish money to invest in Scottish business and the Scottish economy. And to put that in some sort of context, the new Scottish Investment Bank is getting £2 billion over the first 10 years from the Scottish Government. So this is a huge increase in the sort of level of funding which would be available to invest in Scottish enterprise. And that means everyone, absolutely everyone, would have a stake in the country's economy. And it would give Scottish entrepreneurs a constant source of loan funding. It wouldn't be foreign funding, it would be Scottish funding. Young people could build up substantial capital to help in their lives by, their money being put away, or some of their citizens' income being invested for them while they're growing up. And there would be a menu of funds. It doesn't have to just be national projects. It could be locally allocated too. There could be a provision for that. And it frees the creatives and entrepreneurs to develop their skills in businesses and trade both globally and locally. So it basically means that they don't need to worry. They've got a basic income to fall back on. So they're not dependent in the first few years of their business, basically to make ends meet, to keep the wolf from the door. So it has a fantastic benefit there. And how it addresses the challenge of globotics. Now, globotics is basically the effect of globalization and robots on the economy and how that will develop over the years. And it could be quite a scary prospect for a lot of people, because it's estimated that there's something like between 60 and 70% of all the jobs that we do today will be taken up by robots within the next 10 to 20 years, even in particularly white-collar jobs, which are the ones to a large extent which have been protected in the past. But this gives you the UCI that we're funding through the AGFIR, it gives people the opportunity of a financially independent life, even if most human jobs are replaced. It also gives you the opportunity to acquire a wee bit of marginal land if you want to do something with it. Land's quite a good thing to spend your time if you're going to have more time to do things as well. As our public funding is obtained from our land and not through the variables such as tax and income or consumption, there will be significant changes in employment, but that won't be. That will not affect the actual amount which can be gathered in AGFIR, unlike in VAT, which depends on how much we buy, and income tax and depends how much we're earning. So there's also, as I say, over the next 50 years, the most sheltered jobs will be those which are creative. So that's in the arts, the intellectual and social ones, empathetic ones. So the UCI will give people, a financial embrace, basically, and also give them the time and opportunity to develop knowledge and expertise through higher and further education. If we're not working as long, then the extra time that we've got, this gives us our opportunity. And provided that, this globotics is harnessed and accepted the challenge by our government and they invest in it, then, the work-life balance of people should improve. So rather than being an economy which encourages overtime and all that kind of stuff, we change the culture to maybe not working so many hours in the week, but having the wherewithal, to live a fulfilling life. So the options under independence are by funding all public services. Scotland does not rely on the volatility of oil revenue. We still have it, if we wish. We don't rely on the largest UK taxpayer. We do not impose any personal or business taxation, but we can increase public revenues, I've shown. We can still impose behavioural taxes such as minimum pricing and also other taxes to that are targeted towards ill health or whatever, such as maybe gambling or alcohol and that sort of stuff. We can avoid government borrowing. It's not affected by the currency that we take, so we can make a decision on that, based on a fairly good position that we are in a strong position if we don't need to borrow internationally to decide what currency we use. And we have control over our economy, and we can encourage spending within Scotland. So, can it be introduced very quickly? Well, it can, because Revenue Scotland already exists. It's an arm of the Scottish Government. It's not part of HMRC. And it already collects some taxes, like Land and Buildings Transaction Tax, and it already integrates with the Land Register. It works very closely with them. There's software for online registration already exists. It's not this is not a new science by any manner of means at all. They're readily adaptable software out there in the market. And you have online facilities to measure the extent of property, such as daftlogic.com. Scottish Government also has on the Land Register their Scotland site, which is beginning to measure these things too. Or you can just use a tape measure. I mean, it's as simple as that, basically. And then, there we go. And also, there's no need for cooperation, as I've said, with the UK government to introduce this, which is a major headache, which I know that the Scottish finance ministers have, that they don't know what their budgets are going to be because they're waiting to hear what the block grant's going to be from Westminster, and that's delayed and delayed and delayed as it was last year. And the Land Register of Scotland already has what's called a cadastral plan, which is a massive plan of Scotland, which basically charts all the properties with title deeds which are registered there. Now, about 60% I think, of all properties are now registered in the Land Register, but the other 35% are recorded in the General Register of Seasons, which is the older register that's been going since 1617. And basically, in order to expedite the registration, the completion of the Land Register, basically what would happen is that when the owner of a property registered for AGFR, they would be able to, if the title wasn't registered in the Land Register, they would be able to draw down an Ordnance Survey map and indicate on that the extent of their property. And that would actually automatically kick in to the Land Register as well to commence the completion of the register of that title too. So it would kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. Okay. There we go. Now, just to give you an indication, all I've said is that this is basically the AGFR as I'm showing it is based on the land surface, etc., within Scotland, and you know the bottom of our logs, but not our seabed, etc. But it would be possible if in the future a Scottish Parliament decided that they also wanted to charge an AGFR on the mineral rights in Scotland, because in most title deeds in Scotland, you don't own the mineral rights under your property. They are owned or were reserved by either the Crown, local authorities, the Kirk, former landed estates, and people like that. So they have separate titles for most land or mineral rights in Scotland. So it would, in theory, be possible in Ors to charge a separate AGFR rate for that. And then there's also our exclusive economic area, the area within the red boundaries, and that's 5 times our land area. And the bottom of the sea is land, of course. So it would be possible for the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, you know, to consider sometime maybe in the future of actually assessing an AGFR rate for our seabed, for activity, for licenses and all that kind of stuff on our seabed. So here's a couple of last slides here. This is just sort of showing, giving an indication of somebody in average earnings, what their position is net income wise, under the present system without AGFR, devolution with AGFR, and independence with AGFR. And you can see just now that their net income is about 15.2. Under devolution, because they'd be getting the universal assistance income of 10,000, it's going up to about just over 26,000. But with independence, it would be nearly 31,500. So basically, independence is, you know, indicates that it's the most favourable system of government for us if we want to, you know, exploit this to the fullest. But what's this really all about? It's actually about more than taxation or public funding. It's about the stewardship of how we deal with land to maximise its economic, social, environmental potential. It's about reconnecting urban Scots with the land, and it provides an outlet if we've got more time in our hands, because there's so much of it nothing's done with. It's a dependable public funding from land, so it allows us to choose a better work-life balance, as I've mentioned. It provides true independence with a new type of economy, which isn't driven by the global market. And it can also provide a real democratic ownership of our assets. And finally, the Great Steward of Scotland, that's one of Prince Charles's titles, but I actually think it's the Scottish Government's responsibility, to steward our land property in the interests of all of us. And I've called it happiness. I reckon this would make most people, if not all of us, very, very happy indeed. And that the question is put, are you a believer? So, how much AGFA would your household pay? If you want to email me, you can email me your name, property address, postcode, house type at that address, and I'll try and work it out. I've got one or two to do. Sometimes if a house only has a house name and not a number, it takes me a wee while to check out the actual location of the particular property. But I might have one or two extra questions to ask in certain locations. But I can generally give you an indication of what it would be under this system. And finally, I've written a book on this called Annual Ground Rent, Floor and Roof Rent. Annual Ground, Floor and Roof Rent. It's now been published. It's £10 for the book, including post and packing, and it's available from myself or from annualgroundrent.com, and it goes into greater detail of what I've been trying to sort of explain tonight. So that's the presentation. I'm delighted to take any questions that you might have to make. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Graeme. That's great.
Okay.
We have got. I had a couple of questions put in before the evening, and then I've been making notes as they've come up during the chat.
Okay.
The first one that came in, it wasn't really a question. It was more a statement by Bernard Page. Bernard, would you like to make your point, please? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
You
have to unmute yourself, Bernard. And then can you start again, please?
If we wanted to stay in the EU or go into the EU, there is a requirement for 15% VAT on a lot of goods as a minimum and 5% on other items.
Yep.
This gets rid of VAT, so does this mean we could not rejoin the EU?
The position is, you're quite right. Under the current rule, we've got to have some form of VAT to be a member of the EU. It doesn't negate the system. All it means is that we don't benefit as much from the savings which I'm proposing. But just as if we introduce this under devolution, as I've indicated, there are UK taxes, UK imposed taxes which we need to pay. So, and that being one of them. So the position would be that if we decided to rejoin the EU, and we couldn't negotiate with the EU to dispense with VAT, then VAT would be an add-on which we would need to pay. That's right. But that would be a decision. That would be part, I suppose, of the decision that we would make as to whether we thought it was beneficial to be in the EU or not. I'm quite agnostic about that position just now, I must say.
Land values are quite variable across Scotland. So in areas like Edinburgh, they're high. In the Highlands, they're very low. So I live in a 2-acre plot with a listed building, and I'm retired. So I reckon I would be paying about 80,000 a year, and my pension is 30-something thousand a year, just over. So effectively, I'm bankrupt if this comes in.
Well, there would be, obviously...
There's no development value on the land.
Yeah.
It's a listed building, so it cannot be developed.
Okay.
So it's effectively, I'm a custodian of a building in a quarry that would not allow development around it. So are you suggesting that local authorities allow any development in around listed buildings so that people can realise an asset?
No, no. I mean, the position is that planning still exists and planning would exist. So one would require planning permission, and how planning develops would no doubt be influenced by this system. But the planning regime would still exist, and that's not to suggest for a moment that that this system would basically encourage more, shall we say, inappropriate development or development which doesn't take account of green belt and other issues like that. But as regards what you're saying about your own situation, I've been trying to find out what percentage of the population fall into a similar position to yourself. And there are no actually publicly available pieces of work to indicate that that's the case. So I looked to Helensburgh because I live near Helensburgh, and it's got a lot of big houses. There's a few folk that live in them on their own. And from what I can gather from my knowledge of Helensburgh, it's about 1% of people who are living in fairly large, handsome either properties or properties with gardens that one would anticipate have, shall we say, restricted income. So it's a relatively small percentage of the population, but this isn't designed, to force people out of their homes right away by any manner of means. There would have to be a mitigation involved, maybe for the first 5 to 10 years, so that we change the culture in this country of how we look at the properties that we have and own, and how we maintain them. And I would reckon after, say, a period of maybe the first 5 to 10 years, people would, because they knew how AGFOR worked, they would rearrange their affairs in a certain way, so that they might say, right, okay, when I get older and the kids are away, etc., I'm not going to need this big house, and I should really be looking maybe to move to something else. But there's no intention, that people should be pushed out their house because of that they can't afford initially. This is involving a change of culture, and it's quite possible to have a mitigation in place where, for example, the AGFOR could be deferred until somebody sells the house and then it's taken off the price, or some other arrangement like that. It's certainly possible to think.
But it would never be valuable enough to get that money back. So that's the problem, isn't it?
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, it's. I mean, there's different ways of looking. First of all, we're looking, as I say, we're looking at a very small percentage of the population, a really small percentage of the population, and so that the actual cost of putting in mitigation for that small percentage is not, in the scheme of things, going to be a huge amount of money. But a lot, from my experience as a solicitor, a lot of people who did have fairly big houses, who are living alone and died, and most of their estate was in their house. Okay, they might think, well, it was a shame that my children didn't benefit from that, but that's what happens in life. You have these things, and they have inheritance tax and all these other sort of things which that there's a liability to pay. So it's balancing one against the other. But I mean, my own feeling would be that we're actually looking at a change of culture here, and if the benefit is that we can actually make life better for 99% of the people in this country, I think that's a pretty good achievement. But as long as we're sympathetic, to the needs of people who might otherwise feel a bit marginalised by it.
Okay, thank you. It's been suggested by one person that I read out all the questions. I can't actually do that because I didn't write the questions down when they came into the chat. Otherwise, I would have been writing away and not hearing a word that Graeme said. So people are going to have to read their own questions, I'm afraid. The next one who came in before the meeting was Pat Simpson. Pat, would you like to read your question? Ask your question?
Can you hear me now, Chris?
We can hear you.
My question, very much like the last one, and again, I'm illustrating by my own position. When we bought this house, we intended it not just to be a family home, but to be a secure home for us in our retirement. Now, all costs at the time, taxes, etc., as well as mortgage, we were perfectly able to deal with from one income without the need of a second one. Now, I'm widowed, living in this house, which is now serving the purpose, one of the purposes for which we bought it. I can pay all the necessary taxes at the moment, but looking at the figures that you're quoting, I would not be able to pay them under the new system.
Well, Pat, I mean, if you want to email me the details of your property, I'll have a look at it, and I can come back to you in confidence in that.
The point being that even if the figures that you're showing are our starting point, through time there would inevitably be revaluations, because property values, land, there's nothing else in the world is going to stay the same over the next. I've been here 54 years, and as it is, even if there were a modern market value on a house, as a revaluation, I would find it difficult. Now, moving, in my particular case, not everyone will feel the same, but I feel that the major part of my life has been here. The life that we developed together here is what has made me the person I am. Therefore, everything related to that is in this house. Do I have to give it up because of the tax system?
Well, no. I mean, I've said that there is no necessity for somebody in your position, if you were financially disadvantaged as a result of it, to give it up, because there would be a mitigation for your specific position. In addition to that, of course, you would be getting an extra £10,000 a year, which you're not getting just now, because you would be entitled to universal assistance income on top of any retirement pension that you've got. So there would be some benefits there, but say that is a position which I have calculated, as far as best I can, that it probably affects about 1% of the total population of the country. But having said that, because it's 1%, it would be possible, to produce a system whereby there were referrals or other deferrals or other mitigation, until such times as you decided that you wanted to leave the property. But as I say, it's about changing the culture of ownership of a property, and saying basically, if I own a property, I've got the obligation to maintain it, going 10, 20, 30 years or whatever, and being in a position to do that. And I'm not saying that you're in this position, but there are a lot of people that are in really quite substantial properties where they're clearly not maintaining them, and it's understanding that the culture of maintenance and repair, and being able to afford and actually have a comfortable life, because at the end of the day, this is all about people having a quality of life.
I said, in our particular case, all these things were taken into right at the start, because that's the way my husband used to work.
Right,
And there's, the question of ongoing maintenance was something that was factored in by him to all the planning from day one. Yeah,
I know. But I mean, you can find that you're hit with a bill. The best will in the world, you can hit with a bill you at least expect, even though you're maintaining a property. And if you are on restricted income, that can be a big challenge. Even just to get a chimney repaired now, it costs probably about £4,000. That's a lot of money for most folk. Things like that.
Cowboys.
Pardon?
Cowboys.
I had one done the other day, actually, and it's a very reputable company in Helensburgh. Maybe we shall move to Helensburgh, and you'll save a bit of cash there. But it's a fair point you make. But as I say, it's a relatively small percentage, and what I'm proposing here is illustrative. It's not the final thing. I've just shown four types of land types but you could actually, change these and have various variations of them, and various rates. And also there could be local rates as well as national rates. So, these things would be varied accordingly. But it's the kind of theory of how this can be done, and putting it into some form of practice. Now, I reckon, if I've hit the button with 90% of residents in this country, I think that's a pretty good attempt. There will always be people that maybe might not win as much as other people in any sort of system. But I think, we've got the nucleus of a system which is extremely workable.
Mm-hmm. I think that, there are variables in there that obviously I haven't taken into account yet. For example, that when you're looking for a house to buy, the size of the plot on which it stands is not something you have any choice over. That has been decided by the builder in terms of the site he had to work with. And as in my street, there's vast variations between the plot of identical houses.
Yeah, that's right.
So only one comes up for sale at a time. So you don't get a choice that way.
I think we need to move on.
Move on. That's
good. Thanks, Pat. Elaine Mackenzie, you had a few points, but please don't take up all the time.
Hi. I'm having to look through my points. My first one, Graeme, was what does private forestry come under?
Well, forestry and woodland is it's the same whether it's owned by a private individual or company or whether it's owned by the Forestry Commission. So it's basically got its own land type under my illustration.
Okay. In Argyll alone, you probably realise, especially here in Kintyre and Mid-Argyll, there's loads of ransom strips all over the place. Duke of Argyll was very, very good at that kind of thing and still are. And in fact, there's descendants on sideways here that own a lot of land that have the same thing. I'm wondering if the land registry at this stage actually has a list of all that.
Well, they have where the big estates have been registered in the land register. Now, Buccleuch Estates, they've completed their registration in the land register. They did that as an exercise 2 or 3 years ago, but the land register is still working away with the big historic landed estates to complete their registration. Similarly, it's not just the big private landowners, the public landowners are the same. I mean, the Forestry Commission, you would imagine, given that the Forestry Commission was just established after the First World War, that their title deeds would be quite exact and precise with plans. But there's been quite a ding-dong battle, I understand, in the land register with the Forestry Commission about what they own and what they don't own. You've got the likes of Network Rail, whose title deeds basically go back to the development of the railways in the 19th century. And a lot of these railways were developed with title deeds that didn't have any plans at all. They were just descriptions. Some had plans, but they weren't very accurate. But when nationalisation came in, they really didn't do anything to tidy up the titles. So that Network Rail, most of their title deeds, they don't even know what they own in many respects. So that's another one where a public sector, has not been particularly attentive to that. But you're right with the ransom strips. I mean, I know we were looking at a property near Dunkeld not so long ago. And it was the first time it's been sold by the estate. It was a house with a wee bit of ground. And specifically, they retained a ransom strip between the road and the actual grounds so that they could control that. And this would stop this, because they would need to pay, the estate would need to pay the AGFR on the ransom strips, which they retained. And they hold on to that land because it doesn't cost them anything. But if land becomes a liability as well as an asset, where you've got to pay the AGFR every year, then they've then got to take that into consideration, and is it worth holding on to, or should we try and dispose of it? instead of holding on to land and waiting until the government comes along and says, well, we're going to change the direction of this road, so we need to buy land from you in order to do that. So they just sit on that for maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years or more. And then one day they come along and Bob's your uncle, you know, they're making a fortune out of that. But in the meantime, they've done nothing with the land at all. You know, so they've benefited, you know, just in the fact that they own it, as opposed to, or they might own it, as opposed to actually doing anything productive with it. And by productive, I don't mean just economically productive, you know, socially, environmentally, etc. too.
My last point would be also, why would you allow overseas people to own land in Scotland? Can you make an argument for allowing them to own land in Scotland or property?
Well, I think there are some pretty good landowners in Scotland, whether they're Scottish, British, Welsh, you know, Irish, Danish, or whatever. But there is.
What I mean is that they don't reside here. I don't object to somebody living here who owns it, but it's when they're actually absentee landlords. There's a I believe up at Tom and Tow. It's actually a Malaysian landowner there, and there's a playground for him. So my case there is about making an argument for people like that.
Well, as I said, that's for policymakers to decide. We've had an open door policy in this country about who can buy property. You know, if government and parliament decides that, you know, we're going to restrict it and say, yeah, there's got to be a residence position. Or limit the amount somebody or some organisation can own. I don't really have a problem with that at all, not at all. But the thing is that, you know, we have just now a lot of landowners and a lot of property which is owned by offshore trusts and things of that nature, and actually trying to find out who are the beneficial owners of that land is really quite difficult. With this system, the obligation is on the owner of the land, whoever it is, you know, to make the return. So that's actually disclosing the ownership, so that if they don't make a return, and they don't make a return for 3 years or pay it, then they lose the land. That's basically it. So regardless of whether it's a Scot who doesn't make the return for 3 years, or it's an individual from another country who doesn't make the return, you know, they're treated the same way, in that they would basically more or less forfeit the land holding which they have. And it also clears up the position that there are large pockets of land in Scotland. They're quite small, but they're, you know, cumulatively it's quite a lot, where there is no title, or the person who had the title died, or it's what we call a lapsed trust in legal terms and things like this. That would be resolved too, because after the 3-year period, if there hadn't been a return made, then Revenue Scotland would fall heir to that ground anyway. So that would resolve all these problems that have cropped up in the past of people saying, oh, I'm just going to try and, you know, claim that piece of ground, etc. It doesn't happen quite so much since the land register came into being, but, you know, it has happened considerably in the past. So it would clear up that problem, because there's an awful lot of areas of Scotland, particularly urban areas, where there might be a bit of land that's been lying derelict and really has taken away from the look of a town or a road or whatever, and it's because there's an issue about who owns it. That will be resolved, because within the 3 years the land register will know exactly who owns it, and if not, then it will belong to Revenue Scotland on behalf of the state.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Leah Gunn Barrett. Are you there?
She just said she left.
Oh,
I think she's away.
okay. Sorry. Her questions were, how much would Donald Trump be paying on his two golf courses, and does any other country use this system?
Right. Well, as far as Donald Trump, I reckon Donald Trump wouldn't be paying anything, because I don't think he pays anything just now either. I think he uses other people's money for everything, but that's just an opinion that I've got. But, you know, I can certainly work out whoever owns the mini estate and and down at Maidens. You know, it's pretty easy to work that out, to be honest, and I might do that as an exercise. And as I say, if he didn't make the return, and for 3 years it remained unpaid, then well, that would fall to Revenue Scotland. As regards other countries, there are other countries that have forms of land value taxation, annual ground rent, etc. But none, as far as I'm aware, has it like this. And the Land Commission commissioned the Reading University basically to look at different forms of land value taxation around the world. And they produced this report, which was basically, it was as if somebody had gone on to Wikipedia and just typed in, you know, land value tax in, you know, Singapore or somewhere like that, and then they did a cut and paste job. But they didn't look at a system which is basically not based on market value, because this system doesn't work on that. This system works on the basis of basically the extent of the land you've got and the property on it and the flooring, etc. on it, and then works out on that basis. So there is no other system in the world, as far as I can judge, that has this system which I'm proposing. So it would be a nice first for Scotland if, you know, we managed to do it, and importantly, you know, if we did now address the issue of poverty. I think that is the greatest sin, that we have such poverty, you know, in our country. And if we can raise the funds, you know, to address that properly, so everybody has the potential of a fulfilling life, then I think that is the most important thing we should address. And if we can do that through this with independence, I'd be delighted to do it.
Thank you. Right, we've got quite a few questions to get through, so we need to move on. Valerie Gold.
And my question was, would this impact more significantly, you know, and negatively on old age pensioners, particularly ones that live alone? Said she selfishly.
Sorry, you finished, Valerie? No.
Yeah, I suppose it's maybe similar to what the other lady was asking about earlier. I haven't got a big house, but I'm thinking, if you're on, I think maybe you've kind of covered this already in your answer to the other lady there.
Yeah, I mean, it would depend, I suppose, on the size of the property you've got, and if you're living alone, and you know whether the extra £10,000 universal assistance income helps or whatever. But as I say, it's the bigger picture is the sort of culture of us developing a culture on how we look at property. Excuse me, how we look at our property, and you know whether one can have a more comfortable life, shall we say, having a property which maybe is not, you know, quite so demanding of the cost of maintenance and repair and all these kind of things. And that's it. But you know, that's really what's behind it.
I'm thinking it might impact. I mean, I take your point about the whole culture of it. I think it is a very, you know, it's a really novel idea in terms of big companies and big landowners. But I'm thinking it might impact particularly hard on elderly women, because a lot of women have very low pensions. I think the average woman's professional pension is something like 25% of the average male pension, and also a lot of women are widows, like the lady, I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name, that's terrible. Is it Pat? It's Pat, yeah. So and I'm thinking, you know, it might impact. I mean, women are already being impacted with the WASPy thing. I'm wondering if something like this might be another negative thing for elderly women.
Well, as regards, first of all, pensions, I mean, the pensions in this country are ridiculously low. Excuse me. And I'm not in any way suggesting that they should remain at the position they are just now. I mean, we're basically, I have shown that, you know, within this package, we have the funds that are already available, public funds, plus I've increased these by, you know, 10%. as well as the universal citizens' income for everybody. So within that, there is huge potential to increase the state pension way above what it is just now, to get somewhere near, maybe the Netherlands, which I think is probably they've got the best of the state pensions. But so that would be a possibility. As I said, policymakers can vary the way that I've done this. There's no great problem about that. So if there are certain groups which are particularly, shall we say, badly affected by it, then a mitigation can be inserted to deal with that. And also, government, if we're independent, then government can start to impose conditions regarding employment, in terms of employment, etc., to improve the dreadful position that we still have regarding gender imbalance in employment. When I was unemployed before I retired, if you were doing the same job, regardless of whether you're a man, woman, or whatever, you get the same pay if you're in the same sort of doing the same sort of job. And I don't see why that shouldn't be the case. But as I say, government would have the power, to address a lot of employment if we were independent, which they're unable to do just now because so much of that is a reserve power.
Thanks very much, Graeme. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Cairns.
Yes, Peter.
You there, Peter? Nope. Right. If you turn up, Peter, I'll ask you afterwards. Brigitte.
Well, mostly a comment, and that is that I think what you're saying. Hiya, Graeme. I think what you're saying is right. It's what we have to do is change the culture of thinking, because we're all coming at this as to how much is it going to cost us, whereas we really have to be looking at who benefits, how we benefit, and then how we would live as a much better society. So I think because we're nearly comparing it to community charge or to rates, which is not the way to look at it. So I don't know if you've got any way of getting people more involved in the culture, that they will appreciate the new way of thinking about the land that we are custodians of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's all down to that. But the very fact that there is an element, obviously, of self-interest that everyone has, the way they vote and all the rest of it. But actually to see the considerable savings that, the vast majority of people will make on what they pay in tax and all the rest of it just now through this. Plus, as you say, the culture, plus the fact that, they're getting universal citizens' income as well. That really, and this is something, if people can see the money in their pockets, then they're going to vote. Vast majority of people at the end of the day vote because of the what their life is like and what they'd like their life to be, and they want a fulfilling life free from poverty and all these sort of challenges. And this gives us the opportunity, because no one, as far as I can see, has actually ever looked at the totality of Scotland's land before and said, gosh, there is so much that, is just not being stewarded. It's not being used in any kind of sensible way at all. As I say, it's not just rural land, it's particularly urban land, because it's urban land where actually the big money from a national point of view can be sourced. And as a result of that, that does it helps to change the culture if people find that they, financially they are far better off, as this system will undoubtedly provide. Okay, thanks.
Okay, James Gray. I think you seem to think that we would become a tax haven. Are you there, James? No, James has gone as well.
Do you want me to deal with that anyway?
Yeah, if you could, please.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as I've said, that isn't intended that there would be taxes on other things such as income or wealth or whatever. And what I would expect anyway is that within the first few years of this system being used, that government would review it, people would review it, and one of the things that they would review is, how the wealthy are contributing towards our society, whether they're being a beneficial contribution towards it or not, and it would still be open, to government to introduce some form of wealth taxation, other forms of taxation. Should that be a decision which is made. This exercise was basically started in order to show that Scotland could fund itself without any financial support from the UK taxpayers. And I think actually it does prove that we could do that. That's the exercise. So say it's up to the policymakers to decide whether we went hell for leather and did a system like this, or whether we went for a system that had parts of this and parts of the existing tax, very complicated tax system we have in the UK just now. It does prove that we can fund ourselves and fund everything that we need to do, and that was, in my book, was the object, certainly the initial object of the exercise. We can, as an independent country, we can decide who we allow into our borders. We can decide, who we allow to own property, and that's, that is a decision that governments on our behalf will make. And if we saw it was the case that our system of living, etc., was under threat from abuses by people that were using our country as, if they thought, a tax haven, then, government can take issue with these things. I mean, I think, although I don't know an awful lot about Switzerland, there's an awful lot of people that seem to think that Switzerland's a bit of a tax haven, but it's an incredibly democratic country with the power invested in the cantons and local communities. So, there are systems which we can develop, and as we expect we would develop going forward, which would ensure that, local democracy, basically had a sort of controlling interest in how our country develops and how we live.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to go down these in order because, quite frankly, I think you've probably answered quite a bit of the questions that are being asked. I'm going to jump now to Kenny McLaren, who's just
Kenny,
in the chat. So, Kenny.
Hi, Graeme.
Hi, Kenny. How are you?
Not bad. Sorry, the camera shut. I've got the book. I've not read it yet, but I've heard this talk a few times, and I think it's really positive. It's getting people to think. Sorry?
I said that's not why you managed to jump the queue.
I was just... the issue I was going to raise was how this impacts on local authorities, because I think sometimes councils are at the end of the food chain when it comes to public funds, and having only really the council tax to raise their income causes too much hardship, and you don't get enough back from the pain of raising it. And I think, could you explain a wee bit more about how it would work with your policy?
Yeah, well, with this presentation, I've really only shown what a national rate would be. But there is no reason, within the book, I go into a wee bit more detail about the devolving of power and finance to local government. So just now, I mean, I think roughly, about 75% of local government funding comes from the Scottish Government, something like that.
Yeah.
It would be possible, to say that, let's say that national government, in order to service national government, 50% of all the funding which is raised is required for national government activity, and 50% for local government activity. It won't be that. I'm just saying that for the sake of argument. Excuse me. So, central government could charge a rate at 50% of what I'm proposing just now, and then leave it to the local authorities to charge their own rate for their own services, which would basically give local authorities far more independence about how they chose to spend their money, what they and what they raised, which would be far healthier, for democracy than at present. I know that local government to a large extent is an agent of central government, because basically implements central government's policies and education and that kind of thing. But if you can give independence, I think, to local authorities to raise more of their tax or their income rather, and this could certainly be achieved through this system. You would find some local authorities possibly that wouldn't need any kind of assistance from central government so they could possibly raise 100% of the income that they require. There would be other councils which wouldn't be in that position, so they would then look to the Scottish Government to bring their funding up to the level that was required. But there is no reason why that couldn't be done. In addition to that, there is no reason why, instead of having 32 councils, we couldn't have 400 councils or 100 councils or whatever. The principle applies. And so this is something which could be a real driver and exercise in local government, so that we have control of our own communities, far more so than we have today. Okay.
Thanks. This actually ties in with something that Debbie Blackwood said earlier on about rather than going for the whole thing all at once, would it be possible to do it as a local, to replace the council tax first?
Yeah. Well, it certainly would be possible to do that. Though obviously you wouldn't derive the substantial benefits right from the start that you would if you just introduced it as a whole. As I showed with under devolution, you'd still have to pay the benefits under devolution, although there are benefits, are not as substantial as if we were independent. So the same thing would apply, if you were just looking at it to say fund local government. You'd still have all these other sort of taxes that you would need to pay. And also the benefit of this is that, generally speaking, introducing new taxes is very, very unpopular. Most governments just do not want to introduce new taxes because it's unpopular electorally. And also, you find that the British system has become so complicated because when you introduce a new tax, generally, there's always people out there looking to create loopholes. So you just add a bit layer of complexity onto it. So if you have a completely new system, you're starting from scratch, then you reduce the potential for these complexities. And also it's a clean break. As I say, the Scottish Government could just bring this in and they don't need to bother with HMRC. HMRC would just wither in the vine, basically as regards, money that they thought they would be paying the Scottish Government. We wouldn't need the block grant at all. We wouldn't, so there would be big, really significant savings, not just financially, but also in the time that's used to interact with them and argue with them and wait for the money coming. So I actually think that, if policyholders will look at this and they agree that, in principle, yeah, this works, it would be electorally very beneficial for a government to bring this in, because, as I say, you're talking about well over 90% of people benefiting substantially in their pockets from what they're having to do, what they're having to pay just now. So that's my feeling about it. But it would be possible to bring it in, but it makes it much more difficult from an electoral point of view to be as persuasive about it if you're not showing the financial benefits that people would have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Campbell Cameron. You there, Campbell?
I am indeed. I think really my question's been addressed. It was really to do with the old lady in the big house story, as to how that would work out. But I'll maybe ask a wee subsequent if I can get away with that.
Camera, Cameron, because you've got a lovely beard, but it'd be really nice to see the rest of your face.
All right, where are we? I've got my video on, but it's not showing up.
Yeah, I've just got your stomach and your beard.
Well, that's not good, is it? albeit that it's much smaller than it once was.
That's your stomach, not your
The beard's better, of course, but there you go. How am I looking now? Is that better?
No, we haven't got anything now. It's better.
Saying that to placate me. I was going to ask, what do we do with the unproductive land? What's your thoughts for the 220,000 acres belonging to whomever? Do we turn that into a wildlife estate and charge folk to come and visit it, or reintroduce the lynx and the wolf? Or what's your thoughts on?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, the position is that really the potential is endless. If you've read Leslie Riddick's book about hutting and the number of huts that there are in Norway as opposed to in Scotland, there's a real potential that land could be made available for people to to build their hut. There's the potential for people, as I say, just to maybe buy an acre or so. It would hardly cost them anything, or just acquire an acre or so, just for the pursuit of exercising their dog or whatever. There's all sorts of things which could be done. The other thing is that because the totality of the total amount being in funds here, rural Scotland is actually creating, not a huge amount. It's about 1.5% of the total. So as a result of that, if there were large estates which basically had a lot of land, which was maybe mountain ranges and things like that, which weren't particularly productive or couldn't be turned to be particularly productive, then there is the possibility that we could have a proper national park in this country where government took over the bits for rewilding, etc., and that we had this wonderful tapestry of land from the borders, right up to the high north and to the Northern Isles, and that would be an area which could be, as I say, could be rewild again. Also, there's the issue of we need more trees. I mean, even though we seem to be doing far better in the rest of the UK in growing trees, we still are a long, long way from the sort of percentage land cover which they have in other countries in Europe. And so there's the potential for growing trees as well, and forests, and having the small forests, or forests that are owned by individuals, etc., in small groups, as opposed to the kind of big forestry commission ones, etc. But there's some possibilities. You could turn it into a wildlife park. You could turn, you could have a course for mountain bikes, walking, anything or everything. And these are communities could do that, as well as individuals. So there's a real potential for whatever you can think, potentially you could use land for. Again, subject, to the planning regime and what, planning authorities, etc., would allow.
The wonderful thing, Graeme, is that the planning regime is up to us. And as a former councillor, I used to complain about this all the time. Mm-hmm. The public can change the planning regime, but we never take the opportunity to do so, because when it comes down to the local plan review, it's a pretty dry thing normally, and people don't engage with it. But if we want housing in the country, and I've always advocated the notion that every house you put in the country and put 2 people in, it soon becomes 3. It's kind of magical. I don't know how that works, but it's always 3. And that's your school role sorted out then. Housing in the countryside then becomes productive, and there's a real opportunity there. But somehow or other, we have to change the planning system from a town and country planning, which is what we teach in the universities.
Yeah.
Town planners get a job in Argyll and Bute or in Highland Council and have no tools with them other than what they've been taught at university, which is an aspect. Keep it.
Yep. Yeah, well, I mean, I agree entirely with that. In fact, I've proposed a few times to the SNP that we should have a policy of deemed planning consent for 4 homesteads in every farm in Scotland. And you know, that would drop the actual price of these plots considerably if it was time limited. But you know, it would encourage, you know, particularly young folk, you know, to either stay in the stay rurally or come and live rurally, and you know, develop their homes and their families, etc., and work rurally. Because I mean, where I live, we're within sort of 40 minutes drive of Glasgow, but we have a falling population and have done so for the last 20 years. You know, in the national park, the west side of Loch Lomond side, and we suffer from the fact that the national park is our planning authority. They trying to get them to agree to have planning permission for houses for families. It's very, very difficult. I was in the local development trust here for a few years, and we got the Kirk, we got the community council, we even got the estate involved, and the estate had said that they would earmark land for housing, both for social and social owned housing and private housing, because we were going to lose our school. And we went to the national park, and they said that they would not grant any planning permission for any housing unless it was tourist related. You know, absolutely crazy stuff. And it's only within, I think, the last 2 years that less estates have got permission to build houses. And you know, it was just absolutely crazy attitude to take.
The one I always point to is Glenmore and Mull, and if you read your history from Loch Brown to Pennygale, really is Glenmore, and that glen used to sustain 100 crofts. And it now has 2 properties on it, really, that stand out. You can see there may be others tucked away, but it's difficult to know where they are if they are. Think to yourself, you could lose 40, 50 houses in that glen without any difficulty at all.
Yep.
That absolutely sorts the whole thing out, you know. But there we are. The one I would point to that was successful in my time at Hale and Butte was Glenputin, between the back road from Cornwall into Oban, which you would drive through that in a winter's night and hardly see a light. And now must be 20, 25 family houses out there. Big houses in many ways. Some of them ranch houses, to be fair, maybe a wee bit too big for the environment. But nonetheless, they're there. And that was to do with a very far-sighted planning officer called Ian Love, now a Planning Irishman. Saw the potential in that, in taking the farms in the glen and allowing them to be developed. And so forth. And now what you've got is a nice house with folk doing a bit of, I suppose, good lifing to some degree. You know, they've got a couple of horses maybe, or some pigs or chickens or whatever. But what you do have is you've got loads of kids, and that's marvellous.
Okay, thank you, Campbell. Norman Cumlingham.
Yeah,
Norman?
Hello, I've lost my lighting, but we'll see how we go. I'm the man from New Zealand.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome back.
Who's now in Glasgow. My questions are around things like the renting side of stuff, where, as I understand, similar properties of the same size get taxed the same. But if if 2 properties are being rented, so the rent for the property will reflect the amount of tax being paid. But if the 2 properties are of very different quality, so you've got one from a landlord who really looks after the place and another that isn't so well looked after, they will be paying the same tax. Therefore, we'll be charging the same rent for 2 different quality properties. How do we work around that one?
Well, I mean, the rent which a landlord charges, you know, comes under separate legislation from what, you know, annual or AGFA would come under. And arguably the legislation protecting, shall we say, tenants, residential tenants from the landlords need to be improved and enforced in many cases. So the quality of the property, should be, or the rent charged for the property should reflect the quality and the standard of the property. That contract between a landlord and a tenant, however, is governed by law, which is separate from the AGFA legislation, which would be put in place. But I think what you would find, first of all, is that more land would become available. An awful lot more land would become available because people that were either unwilling to pay the AGFA or couldn't pay it, would get rid of their land. So you're going to have it at a very, very low price and quite possibly no price at all in many areas. So that then gives us land on which houses can be built, half decent houses can be built, which we don't have just now. So the availability of houses should increase substantially. And that then, basically takes the pressure off people accepting substandard houses from private landlords. And that would be a result of this policy, because one of the whole reasons of this is to make land available. Scotland is awash with land. We've got more land than probably we know what to do with, as evidenced by the fact that people sit on it and do nothing with it for generations. But we have that land available. But once that land becomes a liability and you've got to pay AGFA on it, a tax on it, if you will, then that changes the whole attitude and the culture towards land. And that would then mean that, developers, it could be the social side, housing associations, local authorities, private developers, even the estates themselves would, start to use that land for building. They would start to build houses, subject to them getting planning permission, of course, on it. So that in turn, would improve the quality of the housing that we've got. And hopefully one of the things which you would do, which is a separate issue but is linked, is that something like about 85% of all houses built in Scotland just now are built by the big builders. Your Bellways, Persimmon, George Wimpole, these kind of folk just now. And that really restricts the choice that people have in the mainstream to buy a property. Whereas if you look at a country like Austria, it's the reverse. 85% are all individually designed or whatever. It's not big builders. So, if we can change that culture, then that improves the architecture and the quality of the houses and also what people will demand, because an awful lot of what people demand just now is not what they demand, it's just what they can get. But if we can change that culture so that the cost of the land comes way down, then that means that, if there is more money potentially spent in building the quality into property, then I think that is something that we should encourage.
Well, I'd love to agree with you, Graeme, but human nature being as it is, the builders will then be looking at building the smaller properties to pay less tax on them, not so much the builders, but the people buying them. So the builders are driven by the market. The market will then become, particularly for buy-to-let landlords, will be looking at getting properties that pay the minimum tax that they can charge the highest rent for. And we are then not improving the quality. The money will still be driving the quality of the housing. The people renting them, whether it be, at the moment I'm involved in a wee stushy with Glasgow Council, but we'll put that aside. But in terms of the quality of housing that's being built at the moment, for example, the passive house standard, these houses reduce fuel usage to heat them by 85-90%. But they initially cost more to actually build. So you're looking at people putting more money into these places up front. They need a return on their investment. That investment will be governed by how much tax they're paying. So they'll be looking to squeeze those houses into smaller plots of land. If it's all based on the area of the house. So we get into this, again, we get into the circle of the return on the investment, whether it's in the private sector or the rented sector. The tax will decide, is based on how big the house is. So I don't really see it solving those issues. Now, that as much as it'd be great for lots and lots of new houses to be built to satisfy the demand at the moment, we still have a huge amount of really substandard houses that are being let either privately and socially by housing associations, by, I'm dealing with people recently, brand new houses. Well, 10 years ago they were brand new. None of them were built with a shower. They've had all sorts of problems with leaky windows, leaky roofs. I mean, flat roofed houses, social housing. Who builds a house with a flat roof in the west of Scotland? Well, they did, and not so long ago. So when we talk about changing culture, I think we've got a hell of a long way to go.
Well, I mean, the position is you've got to start from somewhere, and I agree with an awful lot of what you have said. But I mean, one of the major things which dictates property is the cost of land. So if you can extract an awful lot of that cost of land away, then that helps considerably in the number of properties which can be built. You've also got building regulations which maybe need to be enforced a bit better than they are just now and improved. I actually happen to be on the Scottish Citizens Assembly on climate change. One of the 104 people that were chosen by random to be on this, and we're looking at things like that just now. So there's a lot of work to be done without a shadow of a doubt. But if you can start to make land available, which wasn't available before, then that is a good starter for 10. And the more houses that we can have built, then the more power that gives to tenants, it also gives to people that want to buy. I mean, one of the other problems which we have in this country is actually the mortgage market, and how the mortgage conditions are basically imposed by basically the big London-based and southern-based mortgage companies, because there's only maybe about half a dozen of them that really have a stranglehold on it. But the conditions which they insert in so many of their mortgages to lend in this country does not really reflect or encourage a lot of building and different attitudes to building, and individual building and things like that. It's much more difficult to get mortgages if you're you're basically self-building or whatever. So there's all sorts of things that we could do and government could do to change that. They could even introduce something like a national mortgage, which would help an awful lot of people to either get on the mortgage market or maybe move up the mortgage market and release properties and get them improved. Various things that we could do. Right. But this is a real starter in which to change that actually land becomes really, really cheap. And so it allows the social sector and the private sector to build. And hopefully there'll be far more people in that particular market to service that. And you could well find that you get companies from abroad, from Europe, etc., who are used to building in a completely different way, to come in and build in this country and compete with, because the Wimpeys and the Bellways and all the rest of it have had it too easy for so long. They dictate, what goes on to a large extent.
I think we definitely don't want foreign businesses coming in to do what we should be doing ourselves, especially if we follow like the Common Wheel and Scotland 2070, the latest book about developing our own forestry, again coming back to the use of land. So if we develop our own forestry and develop our own timber industries, I agree that then we should be doing this ourselves and building our own houses.
Well, that's right, but the
other thing I'll agree is that I hope that I'm not dismissing your system. What I'm saying is that I think there's a lot of things to be ironed out, because, for example, if we created more wealth in the country in terms of how much more money the government has got to spend on well-being, then we could actually look at retrofitting a lot of really substandard housing at the moment. We could make it even that private landlords have to retrofit their properties. There's lots that we could do with more public funds available, but I still see a bit of a flaw in the fact that regardless of the price of land, there'll still be a drive to build smaller houses to avoid paying more tax, and that's human nature, I think. So, you know, that will still exist. I think we need to look at that in terms of how the tax would work. But congratulations, it's been a sort of a revelation for me that somebody's even thinking about these issues, rather than it just being same old, you know, New Scotland, but same old. So, you know, I'll be looking with a lot of interest to see where this develops. As a lot of
very much. I'm going to have to chip in, because otherwise I think we'll be still here when the cuckoo clock goes off for 10 o'clock, because that told me 9 o'clock is gone. So we really need to wind up there. Have you got any last thing you want to say, Graeme?
All right. Well, just first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and also lasting the pace. I think this is the longest one I've had so far. I had one in London about 3 years ago, where they told me that they were going to have a projector. And I didn't need to bring my own projector, so I went down to London, and it ended up it was in a church in the centre of London, in Soho. And I must say, I kind of thought for a minute, I said, God, if my mother knew that I was appearing in Soho, she'd have something to say. But anyway, so they had the oldest looking projector I've ever come across. So at the end of the day, I just had to stand up and speak to them. And I was there until 10:30, and it started at 7, and I was still standing at 10:30. So this has been a delight by comparison. But I'm very, very grateful to you all. It would be nice to think that, you know, if you want more information, to go and spend there you go, Breeze, that's great. Spend the £10 and get the book, and you know, discuss it amongst yourself. More particularly, discuss it amongst your parliamentary representatives, and you know, get them interested in it, because I'm really looking forward to the meeting with Kate. I've got a huge amount of respect for Kate. And I think, you know, that we can really bring this forward and use our land, which really should be the source of our prosperity in this country, and to use it wisely and use it, you know, in the national and the community interest. So again, thank you very, very much, particularly Ruth, for your sharing of it this evening. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem. Thanks very much to you, Graeme. And just to everybody, the next part of this event is on the 12th of February with Kate Forbes, so don't miss it. I will be reminding you. This video